I'm pleased to be joined by Kelly Golden, who is running for State House of Representatives in District 32, Seat A. So, without any further ado, Kelly, why are you running? What's your journey that brought you to this place?
Um, well, journey wise, I've always kind of been a political nerd, kind of a rush baby, I guess is what they call us. I remember my grandparents, my dad's parents were one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and so anytime there was a presidential election coming, family discussions got very interesting. Um, I guess as a result, my family would never shied away from talking politics, and so that was always kind of part of my upbringing and part of just who I was. And then, growing up and then getting married and raising a couple of kids, politics was always kind of in the background. It was always part of life, and talking with my kids about politics and politicians and different policies that would come through. Um, and so politics was always kind of a someday thing somewhere out there in the future. And then in February, I was at the state capitol the day after the vote for the death penalty for pedophiles vote. And our legislators and our senators were kind of stirred up over that, specifically because there was one East Idaho legislator who claims to be a Republican who voted against that bill and then kind of argued to get her vote changed. And so Boise Capitol was kind of stirred up over that whole thing. And I had a couple of people saying, "Hey, Kelly, you should run. You should think about running. We need to find somebody to replace this person." And so I spent the trip from Boise home, kind of texting a few people and saying, "Hey, who could we find to run against this person?" And all of those conversations kind of came up empty. And then finally somebody said, "Well, how about you? You need to run." And the more I thought about it, the more I ran out of excuses, I guess. And really kind of what distilled it down for me was that Edmund Burke quote: "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." And we were kind of in that position here in Eastern Idaho where good men and women were sidelining themselves. They were doing nothing. And so I decided to jump in the race, uh, not really having political aspirations, not really having you know, that's it's not on my bucket list as far as holding a political office, but I really felt like this particular person needed somebody to stand in their way. They needed an opponent, and voters needed an option. And so up until I filed, and then there's another guy, Sean Crystal, who also jumped in the race, just to give the voters a choice, because we didn't want this person going back to Boise and saying I was elected with 100% of the vote. And so we at least wanted the voters to have a voice. And as I've kind of been on this journey since February, I've been dumbfounded by the support, by the weight that people have been throwing behind me. I have random people coming up to me and saying, "Here's $20, go get them." People are cheering me on from all walks of life, and so it's been humbling. It's been a privilege to just walk this out, and also kind of learn what it looks like even to just run for office. Because up until now, nobody's written a manual or a checklist on what it means to even run. And so I'm hoping that by me running, I can kind of paint that path for other people and hopefully take some of the scary out of it. And I would love to come out with a win on May 21st. I don't know what that looks like, but we're definitely giving it our best shot.
So, as you've been traveling your district, I'm looking at the map over here. It's a kind of a lopsided donut shape with
Yeah, yeah,
Idaho Falls is a different district, but you've got everything outside of it, Ammon, Lincoln, and then the whole drive over toward the west.
yeah.
What are some of the unique challenges that your district faces as opposed to the rest of the state? And also, what are you hearing from people? What are their priorities and their concerns?
Yeah. Um, Kids are a huge priority to this district. Family, this is a family area. People they're very focused on their kids. And so library bill, school choice, those are definitely big topics for them. The other thing that is really hitting a lot of people hard over here is property taxes. Talked with quite a few seniors who they've lived in their home for 20 to 30 years, and they're facing the possibility of losing their homes because they can't afford the property taxes anymore. When a house was purchased for 120,000 and now it's being assessed at 450,000, folks on fixed incomes were really struggling with that. And so the economy is that's a big deal. So even small things like the grocery tax matter to folks over here. The INL site is obviously that's a big factor in a lot of folks's politics, I guess. It kind of skews the economy to some extent. There's an awful lot of folks that are employed by the federal government over here, but then there's also an awful lot of folks who are small business owners and they're just trying to make ends meet. And honestly, recovering from COVID is still a factor. They're still trying to get their feet back under them after spending most of their savings to stay afloat for a year and a half. And, people, they've moved on from COVID, but they still haven't forgotten what Idaho politicians did to them during COVID. And so I think there's also kind of a mistrust of our government in Boise and overall just, is the government actually going to have my back again, or are they going to throw me under the bus if something else comes down the pipe? And I think, we're seeing on a national scale, we're seeing a national government that seems to be preferring other countries and other people to American citizens. And so I think there's just kind of an unrest and a distrust of establishment politicians overall.
Kind of going to that last thing, COVID you mentioned. My just general observation is that there's a lot of people on one side who are still very upset over what happened during that
Yeah,
time. The government lockdown, shutting down businesses, forced masks,
yeah,
forced vaccinations. Obviously, I would guess, the far left of that
yeah.
spectrum are people who, think it didn't go far enough and are hoping for another one. But there's a lot of people in the middle who they just don't want to talk about it. They want it to go
Right.
away. They want to move on. Stop talking about this. Let's just
Yes.
go forward. How do you, as a potential legislator, how would you hold our government accountable so that that
Mhm.
won't happen again, but at the
Yeah.
same time not look like you're narrowly focused on it?
Right. Well, and that is actually a big question because I've talked with people from outside of our state who, um, you know, for the most part, Idaho was saner than many states in our country. And so they're still dealing with backlash from COVID. And they want legislators to take a stand, and they're still talking about masks and vax and all that stuff. And you're absolutely right. A majority of people just want to move on. They're pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. They've licked their wounds and they just don't want to talk about it anymore. And so I've actually talked with a couple of legislators about just the possibility of a memorial bill, just apologizing on behalf of Idaho representatives and legislators for what we put Idahoans through, acknowledging, hey, there are some things that we got wrong, and we own that. And it's amazing in our own personal lives that an apology goes a long ways. When somebody acknowledges that they screwed up, that they did you wrong, that you were injured by their actions, an apology goes a long ways. And so that's kind of something that I've been rolling around with some of our other legislators and senators, just about, hey, what would it look like for our senators and legislators to just own that, hey, we screwed this up and we want to hold people accountable. We don't want to do this again. And I think there is a place for I'll call them the never again bills that were presented this last session, as far as the mask mandates and the vax mandates. And and I've heard stuff on both sides of the coin, as far as, well, if we eliminate all mask mandates, then what does that do to the food industry or the healthcare industry? And I think, you can't not pass those because there's a few exceptions. I think you need to pass those and then add some exceptions in, because obviously, you know, in a sane world, you're going to want somebody who has tuberculosis to wear a mask in a hospital, or somebody who's dealing with a contagious disease. You're going to have isolation rooms in hospitals and stuff like that. And so those are sane exceptions to make. And whereas I think there's just a peace of mind that a lot of our businesses and a lot of our citizens in Idaho really would like to have, that we have things in place to prevent this from happening again. And I think the other thing that needs to happen is probably some uh, some distance, some length mandates on this is how long we can institute an emergency order. A state of emergency should not go on for 2 years.
Mhm.
There's we need to have some checks and balances on that. And so if we pass a state of emergency, say in February during legislative session, then we also need to build into that state of emergency that the legislator is going to reconvene in 60, 90, 120 days, however long it takes to come in and reevaluate that. But that we're going to build in that the legislator needs to be able to reconvene and check that it's not going to go on for a full year before it gets reassessed.
Uh, as far as I know, that actually already is in place, but the previous
Mhm.
attorney general, rather loosely interpreted the statute.
Yeah, it didn't get enforced. And that I think is one of the things too, is I keep getting asked, well, what new bills, what new legislation do you want to present if you get into office? And I keep telling people there's some amazing laws on Idaho books. We just need to enforce them. It's not a matter of new stuff that needs to be introduced. It's just we need to stand on what we already have and make it work the best for Idahoans that we can.
So another issue you mentioned was property taxes. That's something I'm hearing consistently from all across the state.
Yes,
That's a huge issue. The problem though is that it's not necessarily a state issue. It's local government. It's
right.
your cities, your counties, your school districts, library districts, fire districts, sewer
Mhm.
districts, mosquito abatement districts, cemetery districts, all those
Yeah,
different taxing entities that use property tax to fund their operations.
right,
The legislature last year passed House Bill 292 to bring down property tax by shifting some of their existing taxes over to it.
right.
What else can the legislature do to reform the property tax system?
Well, I know that there was a bill that came up that it got killed before it came to a vote, basically asking for transparency from assessors' offices and basically taking the data points that assessors use or are supposed to use for assessing a property and making those data points available to everyday citizens
Hmm.
so that if their property comes back assessed much higher than they believe it should be assessed at, then they actually have those data points to be able to come in and appeal that. And like I said, that bill got killed before it even came to a vote, which I can't even comprehend why something like that would get killed. But I think just that transparency within the assessor's office as far as what data are you using to make these assessments on people's property. I think some of that is really important. And then giving the citizens the opportunity to appeal those valuations is also important because um if you paid $120,000 for your house, okay, say you paid $120 for a TV on Black Friday, and somebody comes back and says, "Oops, actually that TV is worth $12,000, and you owe the difference." In no other world does that valuation mean that you have to pay more. And so if you get a good deal on your house, just like if you get a good deal on your TV or your computer, then you get the satisfaction of you got a good deal. You don't have to go back and pay the difference in the valuation on that. And so specifically for people that are on fixed incomes, for seniors, for veterans as well, I think we need to make that process a little bit more transparent.
Moving on through the issues,
Mhm.
on your website, you mentioned border security, and
Yeah.
that's also a big debate. There
Yeah.
were two memorials that went through the legislature this year. One of them was very strict. It called out the ag companies for desiring cheap labor and being the demand for
Yeah,
illegal immigration in addition to legal guest workers. And it also called to impeach the president for his failure to enforce the border. That one
right,
failed. The
right.
one that passed came from a different perspective, came from the idea that the problem is that we don't have enough guest workers. And so the federal government needs to reform the process, bring in more, I think it's H-2A visas, and
Mhm.
also implicitly, because it didn't say anything about it, it implicitly called for amnesty for the 35,000 or more illegal aliens who are working here. Um, During a debate on a different bill, a bill at the very end of the session to allow police to record the immigration status of people who got into car accidents or committed crimes, it
Right.
was actually the incumbent in this race stood up on the floor and said that illegal aliens are involved in every, you know, point of food production. That if you eat food in Idaho, it's been touched by an illegal aliens, and so you can't go after them. How how do we enforce our laws and enforce our border while at the same time not completely gutting our economy?
Right. I grew up in southeastern Washington, which is very agricultural. So the wineries, orchards, hops, asparagus, Walla Walla onions. It's very agricultural, and so I'm not a novice when it comes to guest workers. And honestly, some of the guest workers that I interacted with in Washington were some of the hardest workers that I ever encountered. And on the other side, my son, he's in his 20s, he drove spud truck for spud harvest this last year. And so the idea that only guest workers provide all of the labor for our food supply, that's a misnomer there. Um, so I think we have a system that has been working for decades as far as bringing guest labor in and providing them a stamp, providing them green cards, and providing some kind of accountability, and I'll say tracking, but I know that's like a bad word in the age of Big Brother and NSA. But basically we know who these people are and we know where they're at and we know their intentions for being here. The idea that um, Biden's open border is solely for the benefit of agricultural workers or ag farms. Anybody who provides an agricultural service, I feel like that's an insult to our ag industry, because they have been some of the hardest working people in our country for years, and they've made it work without flooding our borders and bringing a whole bunch of people that we don't know who they are, where they are, or what their intentions are here in our country. And so I think that quite honestly is kind of just a load of baloney. I do feel like we need to close our borders. I've kind of made the comment that even heaven has walls and gates. And so we need to be able to build the wall, allow people to come in legally, whether that means temporary visas or whether that means citizenship. Um, we need to. We don't have a country if we don't have a secure border. No place else on the planet are people allowed to just come and go as they please and have free reign and access and benefits all over the country. If you come illegally, that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And so, the idea that we've just flooded our border with people that we don't know is that's not the fault of the agricultural industry. That is the fault of an administration that is wanting to undermine our country.
Shifting gears again,
Yeah,
the incumbent in this race was censured by the Bonneville County GOP
yeah.
for what they say is, not supporting the Republican platform.
Mhm.
What do you think of the relationship between the county committees, legislative district committees, and
Mhm.
the legislators? Uh, Obviously, there's some tension there in some
Yeah,
places, and in she was obviously defiant at that censure and
yeah,
and said that the voters would decide, which is true. Uh,
right.
what do you think? How do you think the relationship is now? Is there a way to repair that relationship, and what should that be going forward between the party and its representatives?
Right. I think it's really important to understand the relationship between the central committee and the precinct committee officers, because precinct committee officers our PCOs, precinct committee men, as they're named in other places in our state. Those are the ultimate grassroots. They are your neighborhood representative to legislators and senators. And so the central committee does not control PCOs. PCOs actually vote to bring in the central committee executive officers. And so I think the idea that, and that I believe it has, I think it's 50% of PCOs have to vote in order to call one of the legislators to account. That, and honestly, granted, the idea of investigative committee, some of the language that was used in that whole process is naturally inflammatory. And so that's kind of, I'm on the communications committee here in Bonneville County. And so that was one of the things that as a committee, we were asking, why in the world are we using this language? Because it naturally puts people on the defense. I think it is regrettable that our legislators responded the way that they did, because those PCOs, they are not paid, they're not lobbyists, they really are the grassroots neighborhood representatives of the voters. And so to thumb your nose at a PCO and to say, you don't matter, I answer to the voters, it's kind of double talk, because those PCOs represent the voters. They represent their friends and neighbors in their particular district or precinct. And so a legislative district is made up of the precincts within that district. And so, within 32, there's there's a whole bunch of precincts that are represented. And so it's important, I believe, for legislators to respond in those situations. Part of my background is also administrative committees and HR teams. And so I've been in hiring and firing processes, and also just in employee reviews. And when you dig down into what that Article 20 really is, it's an employee review. If one of my bosses has a question about my job performance, then I owe it to my boss to go have a conversation with him. And one of the things that we've lost here in Idaho and across America is the idea that we, the people, are technically the boss. Our legislators and our senators work for us. And so if the boss has a question about the performance of their employee, then they have every right to ask for a review, to ask for a conversation and say, hey, can you explain this to me? Why did you act this particular way? Why did you make this particular decision? Because you're the boss, you own the company. As far as whether or not that relationship can be mended, I don't know. I know that there are very strong opinions on both sides. I think the fact that it was taken to the media as quickly as it was, without any conversation, without any dialogue between our legislators and our legislative district, the fact that it became so public so quickly, I think really burned a lot of bridges. It, it happens in families, it happens in companies, it happens in churches. When there's a misunderstanding and it goes public, it blows things way out of proportion, when a conversation could have really solved an awful lot. At this point, I know that the particular incumbent for 32 has continued to refuse to sign any of the integrity and affiliation stuff. She's refused to have any further conversation with the PCOs or the legislative district heads. So I don't know. I know that the PCOs have continued to send emails and post on Facebook and try to get comments from her. I was at a candidate forum last week, and there were some very intelligent, well-spoken constituents who showed up and wanted to ask questions. And I don't necessarily know that they got their questions answered. I think they kind of felt a little dismissed and a little brushed off.
One of the things I'm seeing within the Republican Party is a debate over, I would say, the role of government.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the biggest what's causing this divide is that you have a lot of people who say, wait, the government's grown too big, it's too powerful, it spends too much money, takes too much of our tax money, and it really needs to be scaled back to just what our founders wanted, protecting
Right.
our life, liberty, and property.
Yeah.
But then you have others who have said, whether pragmatically or optimistically, that there are some things that the government already does and can do to improve, people's lives, and even such things as, handling water rights or emergency medical, assistance, uh,
Right.
public schools, that there are things this government needs to do and can do and should do. Where's the line there, and how do we, you know, how, how do we talk to each other?
That's a really good question. I think that it's kind of a twofold answer. Number one, the people have lost a lot of trust in government. And I think COVID just exposed an awful lot of that. Um, kind of here in Idaho, but across our country, we saw government officials that would make rules and mandates for the people that they, as government officials, were exempted from, whether it was shots, whether it was masks, whether it was eating outside, like we saw with Governor Newsom, whether it was keeping small businesses open or closed. It really highlighted that divide of us and them. And so the people, the citizenry, really started to look at government as elitist, and they have no idea what we're going through. And so I think it fostered this mistrust in government overall. The other thing that we see is John Adams, after the Constitution was signed, he said the Constitution was written for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. And so, as we see our country getting farther and farther away from moral law, any kind of religious language, any kind of religious um, input into our lives, then the Constitution, there becomes this tension between what the Constitution was designed for and then the practical walking out of all of it. Take freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, when you have a moral and religious people are going to check themselves. They're not going to use freedom of speech to get on social media and tell people to kill themselves. They're not going to they're not going to use freedom of speech to spew hatred at other groups because they have a moral compass that is going to be checked. And so I think some of the tension where we see government getting bigger than it was ever intended to be is government is starting to fill in those gaps where there is a moral lack in our country. And so where people refuse to govern themselves, where they refuse um, to walk in it with a moral compass, then government all of a sudden starts to step in to protect people from their own lack of morality. And so when you say where's that line, I'm not sure where that line is, because I would love to see America be a moral and religious people again that can just live peaceably under the Constitution and not need a whole bunch of oversight. But when you have a 3-year-old kid who's constantly just getting into stuff, you have to hover. You have to make sure that that 3-year-old doesn't hurt himself or somebody else. But as a child grows up and becomes a little bit more aware of their surroundings and aware of what's right and wrong, then they naturally start to check their own selves, and they don't hit people in the face and take other people's trucks and stuff. And so um, I think it's kind of a twofold issue. When we start to see America find its compass again, then that's when we're going to be able to kind of pull back on a lot of the legislation that honestly seems ridiculous. Like, the don't eat Tide Pods. This should not have to be a law that is even on the books, or a rule that you put on a, or a sticker that you put on a container. And so I think there's definitely it's a bigger issue there, but I feel like our founding fathers intended for America to continue to be a moral and religious people that is able to govern itself without a whole lot of oversight and a whole lot of overreach from government.
Well, that was the intention, I'm sure. But, to use your
Yeah,
analogy of the 3-year-old getting into things, 3-year-olds, like you said, eventually grow up and they can govern themselves. So I think our country is doing it in reverse. We were once a people who could govern ourselves, and now we're not.
yeah.
For the last 100 years, go back to the New Deal,
Hmm.
where government started taking over what used to be the functions of charities or churches or communities, and taking care of people, giving people a safety net, and that's only
Yeah.
expanded.
Hmm.
uh, Earlier this year there was a bill before a committee to put some sideboards on the Medicaid expansion program, and hundreds of people signed up to testify against it because they were worried they would lose their benefits.
Yeah.
So have we reached a critical mass where too many people are dependent on government, and so we can't roll it back, both pragmatically because then they'll be left high and dry, and also
Right.
politically because they'll vote against you and put in someone who will continue the programs.
Right. I think if we haven't reached critical mass, we're very close to it. One of the talking points for all of us as candidates right now is that more than 40% of Idaho's budget is federal dollars. And there's a lot of people that say we need to cut that off. But they don't understand that if you cut 40% of Idaho's budget and you don't have something to fill that gap, you're going to crash our entire state's economy because we have become so dependent on benefits and on entitlements, I'll say. And so yeah, it's not something that you can turn around even in one term. That has to be a goal that we set, and then we work it out over years, because it's not something that we can just undo with one particular bill that we all vote on and say, oh, no more on Medicare, or no more on food stamps, or any of those entitlements that we've gotten really used to in our country.
So is there a way to slowly roll that back? Is there a way to create an off ramp for people to get off that? Or,
Yeah.
'cause obviously people are dependent on government. We're dependent on the federal government. Businesses and industries have become dependent on government. It's got its fingers in everything. And how do you pull that back?
Yeah. Honestly, I've talked with quite a few folks, and I would love to see Idahoans be able to keep more of their paycheck. Because and it, I know that in principle, the launch program should work, but it shouldn't be government funded. We should be looking at trade schools. We should be looking at apprenticeships and internships for the next generation of kids coming up. And so I think kids being able to earn a living wage is really important. I mean, I have boys that are in their 20s, and the economy is completely out of control as far as what it takes to get married, move out, and have an apartment and be self-sustaining. And so we've gotten to this point where, and honestly, I think some of it's on purpose. We know the Agenda 2030 says you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And so the idea that Americans are dependent on the government, that's actually on purpose. If we're completely dependent on the government for our sustenance, then we don't own anything. We're just kind of slaves to the entitlements at that point. And so in order to roll that back, we have to it's almost undoing an awful lot of brainwashing that no, you can stand on your own 2 feet, you can go make your own money, and you can live on your own. And um but that's going to take time. That's going to take some retraining of all of our brains, because we have all gotten used to things being so expensive. Just take medical. Things are so expensive that unless you have paid into either one of the Obamacare programs, or you sign up for a grant at the hospital, or you get socialized medicine, you can't afford an awful lot of the medical care that is necessary in our country right now. And so I think we have to change the way that we think about every single one of these entities, whether it's medical or whether it's food, but employment, any of these things. We have to change the way we're thinking about it first, and then start to prune it back. But like I said, it can't just be cut it off at the roots, because it will completely crash our economy.
Shifting gears again,
Yeah.
for 3 years, there were attempts to put some sort of library bill through to take care of this growing problem, I'd say, of
Yeah,
materials that are obscene and harmful to children
yeah.
that are being put on the shelves of school and public libraries. And they finally got one through this year. The governor signed it. He signed that stinking library bill, as he said. Uh, what do you think of the current bill? And do you think more needs to be done, or is this sufficient to address the problem?
I think the current bill will only be as effective as the librarian's willingness to implement it. I think what we see here in Bonneville County is it's gonna have to be some pressure put on by citizens to actually implement it. Um, so I think if you have some librarians who are passionate about protecting kids, then it's kind of a no-brainer. This will work just fine. But if we have librarians with agendas, which we've seen across our country, it's kind of one of those industries that has kind of become agenda driven, then it doesn't matter what bill we pass, they're going to find loopholes on it. So that's kind of as a parent who has raised kids and gone to libraries for the majority of my kids' lives. Um, there is a dual responsibility. Yeah, parents need to keep an eye on your kids at the library. At the same time, a library should be a safe place that you can drop your kid off after school and they can go study, they can go check books out and not have to be exposed to pornography. Um, Now, do I think that the segregating the books into one particular section goes far enough? I don't know. I feel like if they're, growing up in the 80s and 90s, we had Blockbuster Video, and there was always that section at the back of Blockbuster that, there was an element of shame and embarrassment if you ever wandered into that unwittingly. And so if there's that section in a library, I don't know how well that's going to be protected. I don't know how well kids are going to be redirected away from a section like that. Or if it's just going to be, oh, this is the section where you can get, all of the stuff that you're really curious about, but you're too embarrassed to ask. And so, it could cut both ways. I think it's going to it's going to still play out. Like I said, over here, there's a lot of people that they took the win, but they're still really suspicious as far as whether it's gonna play out and actually have any teeth or not.
Well, I think, like you said, it depends on the librarians and the people who are going to hold them accountable.
Yeah,
And I mean, that was always going to be the case, that it's going to rely on people, citizens,
yeah,
parents
yeah,
to to make sure that those things are taken care of.
yeah. Well, and honestly, I mean, kids, well, all of us as humans, we are curious and we're naturally drawn to the things that we're told no to. If you see a sign for wet paint, you naturally want to touch it. And so, I think one of my concerns with this whole library bill is, did we just put a big wet paint sign over materials that is going to be a nuisance? Is it going to be an attractive nuisance to kids rather than actually protecting them? And so, it remains to be seen how it's going to play out.
So, on the subject of schools,
Yeah.
what do you think of the state of Idaho public school? We keep putting more and more money into it, but then we see that the student achievement is not doing well. You
Right.
have, obviously, certain curricula that is, well, not good, I'd say.
Yeah.
There's pushes for school choice. Obviously, we have school choice in that we can send our children anywhere, but pushes to have money follow the student, although
Mhm.
those efforts have not gotten through the
Right.
legislature yet. What do you think should be done to, you know, make a better school system?
So we have this school starting up over here in Bonneville County. It's called Elevate Academy. I'm really excited about the model that they're building. It starts in 8th grade and goes up through 12th grade, and it's trades driven. It's modeled after finding what kids are geared towards, what they're gifted at, and what they're passionate about, and then incorporating reading, writing, and math into those particular fields. And so, and it's actually a privately funded academy. It's not government funded. And so that one's going to be really an interesting model to see how that plays out. I do think people say school choice, and I always kind of hesitate on that because you don't need more choices. You don't need McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King. You need excellent choices. And so you need choices that are actually going to work. And over here in Bonneville, we have some amazing charter schools. And I know a lot of people would argue with me that charter schools are just government schools repackaged. And I won't argue that. I think some of the charter schools are built towards different kids' learning styles, and I still think that's important. My own kids were raised mostly through private school through 8th grade. We did a little bit of homeschool in that time, and then they ended up graduating from public school here in Idaho Falls. We were very blessed that the public school they went to was fantastic. The teachers were amazing. The content was rich. They learned, they grew. Even some of the, I'll say, moral dilemmas that they were faced with, they grew through that because we live in such a diverse culture that we need to learn how to interact with people that have different belief systems than we do. And so even that was beneficial to them. It taught them who they were and where they stood on particular things. And so um, I've talked with multiple homeschool families about this particular topic, and I've asked them, hey, would you like to have the money follow your kid? And their response is always, well, extra money would be nice, but I don't want the government in my business. And so even homeschoolers, they're really dubious about whether or not there are strings attached. And we all know that there's strings attached to any money that we get from the government. Whether it's oversight, whether it's, fill out a form and Big Brother watches you or whatever else. And so the idea of money following it's a fantastic idea, but then implementing that is a whole different ballgame. How do we manage that? What kind of accountability, if any, do we add to those finances? And then how do we make sure that our kids are actually learning content that is going to benefit them in the future? And that's across the board, whether it's public school, private school, homeschool. How do we know that these kids are actually being equipped for the future that our country is looking at? And I think right now a lot of our public schools are starting to be infiltrated with agenda-driven curriculum, but there's also some amazing teachers who are pushing back on that. And so I'm kind of excited to see what happens within the Idaho school system because you used the term critical mass earlier. And I think we are at that place in Idaho schools where something has to change. Something's got to be done. And everybody sees it. Everybody knows that something has to change. And so I'm excited for the possibility of being part of that change and part of making something better for our kids, because what we've seen in the last 4 years isn't working. And I actually got pushback when I said Idaho kids are ranked some of the lowest in our country as far as their education and graduation rates. And this person said, actually, Idaho's one of the highest in our country. And I just thought, what stats is this person reading? Because everything that I've seen, Idaho really struggles. And so it is time for a change. And I think we have the ability to implement some changes. It's just a matter of doing it in such a way that parents are comfortable with and that really benefits our kids first.
Well, I've appreciated your time. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah.
Is there any big issues that we didn't cover, or just your closing thoughts to the voters?
I think the only other big issue that really that is close to my heart is I really want to do better for our veterans.
Hmm.
There's Idaho is a place where a lot of these men and women come to hide out. They have seen the works that the world has to offer, and they just want peace. They just want a beautiful view from their back porch, and they want to forget how evil the rest of the world is. And um, I've talked with a couple of veterans who have looked me in the face and said they don't want to let that genie out of the bottle again. And in my mind, that gives me the drive to stand up and defend our country from going in the direction of so many other places in this world, because our veterans, they fought for us, they lost limbs, they lost peace of mind, and they came home and they just wanted to put all of that behind them. And the idea that they might have to strap on their boots again and fight on our home ground for our own country, they're willing to, they're absolutely willing to, but they know what war is. They know what it looks like to have to defend a country and defend women and children. And they don't want to have to do that again. And so I think, my heart for veterans is twofold. I want to make sure that they are getting the care and the appreciation that they deserve when they come home. And then also part of that is also defending and making sure that they have a country um, that they don't have to pull out their boots and their helmets again and go defend, because um, that's a chapter in a lot of their lives that they really don't want to have to go back to. And so that's just it's something that I've kept very close to the front of my mind as I'm walking through this campaign. And um, like I said, I want to make sure that we are doing everything that we possibly can for our veterans.
No, that's good. Any closing thoughts, closing pitch?
Closing pitch, you can check out my website at golden, the number 4, idaho.com. 3 weeks left in this whole race. So May 21st is the deciding vote. We don't have any Democrat contenders in this particular race. And so the decision gets made on May 21st. And so we've just really been trying to get the word out that um, May 21st is the big vote, the big race. We vote for president in November, but every other race is decided here in May. So make sure and mark your calendars and get out.
Kelly Golden, running for State House of Representatives in District 32, Seat A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian.